Thank you very, very much. As was mentioned, I've been asked to speak for the need for India to compete and innovate in today's fast-moving world. Now, the two concepts, competition and innovation, are very much related. And I think the problem in India is that we don't have too much competition, which is what I'll talk about, and therefore we have lower than optimal innovation. Now, who makes policy in India? If we try and isolate or try and identify who is it that makes policy in India, we can then go ahead and think of what are the policies that are made, how they are made, and what is needed to change those policies. So, very simply, and I will also talk about Trump and what he is doing to our policy making, or should be doing to our policy making. So you can decide. But the simple fact is, and this is much discussed all over, and especially after both the budget presentation on February the 1st and the discussions about a trade treaty, a mini trade treaty between India and the US. So first, why is there a problem? Or what is the problem? And in my view, the problem is that the policy that is made in India, industrial policy, including very much the problems that MSMEs face, is not made by elected officials. So who is making the policy if it is not made by elected officials? It's made by, and this was an article written some time back about the fact is that the policy is made by a set of individuals who are not elected. So in other words, it is not your politicians that make the policy, even though it is the case that every policy has to be authorized, sanctioned, made, quote unquote, by the policymakers, by the elected officials, the finance minister, and so on and so forth, or commerce minister. So technically, they are the ones making the policy. But in reality, in my view, and that's what needs changing, and I'm actually quite optimistic that that change will come soon, but what needs changing is the fact that the policies that have been made, and I will talk only about industrial policies. There are policies towards agriculture, there are policies towards fiscal side, but really I will talk about the policies towards industry. Now, in that, about policies towards industry, what we have, and hence the need for discussion about the lack of competition in India's industry. I'll just give you an example of the two sectors that are major contributors to India's development. There is the service sector, dominated to a large extent by the software, and there is the industrial sector, of which the MSMEs are a part, a micro part, a major part, but the policies towards them is what is not behaving in a fashion that one would like. So let me continue. So you have these two sectors, and you look at the trade and exports of service-related and manufactured goods. And what we have for the very first time in Indian history, the service-related exports are now higher than manufactured goods exports. What is the dominant part of service-related exports? software and everything related to it. And of course, we now have AI and how that'll change the universe. But even before we get to the AI, we have the service-related exports, primarily computer software and related items, are the fastest growing item where we, India, is better than most countries, including China. So what is it that, how is it that India software exports have performed, service exports have performed so well, both in absolute terms and in relative terms to our manufacturing and in relative terms to China? And I have a very simple explanation for it. It is the one place, or it is the one sector where the government didn't have much of a role to play, or government policies didn't have much of a role to play. So in manufactured goods exports, there was licensing, what you could produce, how you could produce, what's the size of the firm. Even today, right, 30 plus years after the reform started, the government still decides on the size of the firm. Second, or size of the plant now, even down to the plant level. So why is this the case? And I think, and what is the influence of this house, that the deep state, as I have termed it, which is very similar to the American deep state, is dominated. Decisions there are influenced and dominated by major industrialists and major policymakers in the government, that is, bureaucrats. And you know, very interestingly, both Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and Prime Minister Modi have one of the first things they said when they came to power was that we want to have a lot more lateral entry into the decision making, and we want to encourage a constant inflow and outflow of individuals in the policy making. And both of them, to date at least, have not succeeded. Now I come to, and why am I optimistic that this will change? This will change because we now have, and all of you have in the industry, whether it is software or whether it is publishing, etc. You know, look at the example of McKinsey. Why is McKinsey, how has it been so successful? McKinsey has been so successful for the last, 30, 40 years, primarily because they are brought in when there is two people or two organizations or two policymakers or two owners, or it can be more than two, I'm just giving that as an example, do not know how to settle their differences. So therefore, the idea is to bring in an outside expert, and the outside expert, both sides, or n number of sides, doesn't really matter, agree to abide by whatever they are, because they recognize that there's a problem. And the problem is that the firm is not doing so well, so let us, and we are not able to resolve it by ourselves, so let us get expert advice. And that expert advice is then accepted by all parties involved, and you proceed forward. So how is what Trump is doing related to, or what Trump might have an effect, a positive effect on India, related to the McKinsey example? You have interest groups affecting policy, like in every country in the world, and in India. And let us say, for purposes of argument, one interest group says, look, we need to not open up, not liberalize, have tariffs at a very high level, etc. And the infant industry argument, you've heard the infant industry argument, that we need to give them incentives in order for them to grow up. Now, the problem with infant industry around the world is that infants become geriatrics without going through adulthood in between. So that is what we need to correct. And the reason infants become geriatrics is because infants are very comfortable with high rates of protection. Okay? Their profits are easy, guaranteed. There's no accountability. What competition does is accountability. In order to compete, in order to survive, you have to compete. And that is not quite present in the case of when you have the kind of protection, your profits. Protection is basically a protection of your profits. And so why would you go ahead and innovate? I don't see, if I'm making profits, there's no need for me to go ahead and endanger those profits by spending money on innovation, because innovation requires investment. You must have heard that a lot of discussion today, including by the finance minister, is that there isn't enough R&D expenditure by the firms in India. So we need to ask, why isn't there R&D expenditure? Obviously there's some. And the complaint by everybody, except those who should be doing R&D, and so when I talk to the people who should be doing R&D, the firms, and exactly this I ask, why aren't you investing in R&D? So their answer, and really is quite uniform, is that, look, we don't have an incentive to do so. And I said, what do you mean you don't have an incentive? And the answer generally is that, we have to take a risk by innovating, by spending on R&D, absolutely. And we are guaranteed the profits that we are obtaining. That's why we don't have an incentive to go ahead and risk those profits. Very simple, very straightforward. Coming back then to the Trump example, there are policymakers in India, and I mentioned former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, as well as Prime Minister Modi, who are very interested in bringing about a change in our policy making, a change in our industrial policy. So, here is Trump offering that we should cut tariffs. And you must have seen in the papers, etc., a lot of discussion. No, we shouldn't do what Trump is asking, our liberty and our freedom, etc. And I think they're missing the point. We should cut taxes, cut import tariffs, cut non-tariff barriers. The big problem in India is not just the tariff levels, which are the highest in the world, but also the non-tariff levels, which doesn't get engaged in the conversation. But that is where if you will, the infiltration, or that is what affects profitability, that is what affects investment. So I'm arguing that the government should use this, that look, we have to, every country in the world has been affected by what Trump is doing. The US has a big stake in terms of the very, very large economy that they have. Everybody's trade is affected by what the US decides. And I'm not at all talking about whether what US is doing is good or bad. Okay? My emphasis and my concentration is what India should do. And India should definitely cut its taxes that is its import taxes, and should definitely cut some of the non-tariff barriers, the controls, who can produce, where, you have to get permission, etc. Every country, one other point I want to make, that when I bring this up with policymakers in India and outside, and, they say, oh, India is a democracy, we have to cater to this, that. So there'll be 10,000 reasons offered as to why India is unique. Okay? So we can't do this. But then you have an example. There are lots of countries that are democratic and are doing much better than we are. There are lots of countries that are not democratic, all facing the same problems, right? Every country has their relevant poverty problem, their interest groups, their political, whether indirectly or directly, influences. So we all have that. That's the nature of policy making in the world. But they somehow end up doing a lot better than we have. So I have offered this explanation. Here's an opportunity that has been provided, an external opportunity for India to change course. And the difference it will be is the following. For 30 years, India has grown very consistently. Come one, come all. Jamna aaya, Ganga aaya. We have grown at something like 6.1, 6.2% for the last 30 plus years. And I think we will grow at that rate without much effort. But that's not how we should assess our fortunes or misfortunes or our policies, by the fact that we're growing at 6. The Prime Minister has clearly outlined a plan for Viksit Bharat for 2047, which is also mentioned here, everywhere you go. So what is generally agreed on, what will it take for us to achieve developed country status? And there are various definitions, etc., and don't want to get involved. The simple factual or the simple point about growth rates for achieving Viksit Bharat is somewhere around 7.5% to 8% per year for the next 20 odd years. You do that, you will reach developed country status. On the flip side, you don't do that, you continue growing at 6% or even 6.5%. Obviously, this we are talking about a 20 plus, we're not talking about 1 year or so. You are not going to achieve Viksit Bharat. You're not going to be able to satisfy the dreams, the aspirations of millions of Indians, young Indians, who are aspiring and are contributing to the development of the country. They are the ones who will make the future. And they are the ones whose incentives and whose production and whose output, etc., we have to provide them with the best environment possible or facilitate the best environment possible through our policies, that they can go ahead and compete in this not so easy world as was when I was growing up, or 20, 30, 40 years ago. It was easy to compete. Now, the world is wide open. So therefore, there's double reason why we should really try and facilitate innovation, competition, so we can become a developed country and grow at 7.5% to 8% a year. Thank you very much.